The most dangerous weapon in a room is never the gun in a hitman's hand. It's the person everyone has been trained to ignore and neglect. In a city of silver screens and plastic smiles, the most lethal secrets are the ones hidden in plain sight. Roy King's restaurant wasn't just a place to eat. It was a cathedral of glass and ego. Power players whispered billion-dollar betrayals over vintage crystal, while men like kings sat in the center, pretending the ghosts of soul hadn't followed them across the Pacific. He sat beneath light fixtures that cost more than a Midwestern home. His suit a suit of armor made of Italian silk. His expression a mask of stone and calculated silence. To the investors reading about him in Wired, he was the visionary bridging the gap between old-world real estate and the digital future. To the men who whispered his name in the dark, he was still the king of kings. The man who built a throne out of broken bones and iron will. Tonight, he was trying to buy his way into civilization. Rita moved through the room like a ghost in a cocktail apron. She didn't offer the performative, bubbly warmth of the other staff. Her face carried a stillness that only comes from seeing the end of the world and surviving it. Her hands, steady as a bomb technician's, cleared plates with a precision that felt wrong for a waitress. Kings noticed he couldn't help it. There was a coiled readiness in her spine. She wasn't memorizing the wine list. She was mapping the exits. She wasn't serving guests. She was calculating angles of attack. She moved through the space as if expecting a war that didn't exist. Except tonight it did. At 8:45 p.m., the air didn't just move. It shattered. One moment, the room hummed with wealth. The next, the world became lead and gunpowder. Two men in tactical gear emerged, weapons raised to erase a legacy. But as the first shot rang out, Rita's body reacted before her mind could protest. The smell of cordite hit her, sharp, familiar, a homecoming. To understand how a waitress became the only thing standing between a mafia boss and a casket, you have to understand that Rita wasn't born in the kitchens of LA. She was forged in the black sites the government pretends don't exist. And Roy Kings, a man who thought his wealth made him untouchable, was about to learn that the woman pouring his wine was the only reason he'd live to see tomorrow. The monarch's lounge at the Gilded Lily smelled of expensive oud, aged scotch, and the quiet, heavy scent of undisputed power. Roy Kings sat at the corner booth, the throne, watching the digital ticker of his offshore holdings dance across a concealed screen. To the outsiders, he was a titan of industry, his cufflinks catching the low amber light like miniature suns, his presence commanding a gravity that made the air around him feel thick. He wore the luxury of the city like a bespoke suit, but beneath the silk, he remained a predator in repose, his eyes never settling, always calculating the cost of his next move into legitimacy. He was a man who had traded a serrated blade for a fountain pen, yet his jaw remained set with the hardness of a man who still expected a betrayal in every handshake. 10 feet away, Rita moved through the shadows of the lounge with a ghostly, terrifying efficiency. Her world was not one of marble and dividends, but of angles, heart rates, and friction points. While the other servers flirted for tips, Rita's mind was a sterile tactical grid. She didn't see a room of diners. She saw a collection of ballistic trajectories and potential improvised weapons. Her posture was a masterclass in deception. Submissive enough to be invisible, yet balanced on the balls of her feet, ready to explode into violence at a heartbeat's notice. She lived in the silence between breaths, a Tier 1 phantom who had scrubbed her soul as clean as the glassware she polished. Kings was the sun at the center of this solar system, loud and radiant, while Rita was the cold, dark vacuum surrounding him. Two apex predators occupied the same square footage, one basking in the light of his own empire, the other hiding in the shadows of her own survival. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked toward 8:45 p.m., the precise moment the illusion of civilization dissolved. It began not with a shout, but with the sharp, rhythmic pop-pop of suppressed gunfire from the service corridor. The sound was a frequency most diners ignored, mistaking it for a drop tray or a celebratory cork, but to Roy Kings and Rita, it was the opening note of a symphony they both knew by heart. Two men in charcoal tactical gear breached the dining room, their movements practiced, professional, and entirely focused on the man at the corner booth. Roy didn't scramble for cover like a civilian. He moved with the fluid, liquid violence of his youth. As the first assassin leveled a submachine gun, Roy kicked his heavy marble table upward, creating a momentary shield of stone and linen. The first spray of lead chewed into the tabletop, but Roy was already low, sliding across the polished floor with a jagged steak knife he'd snatched in the transition. He wasn't alone in the fray. Rita didn't scream. While the elite clientele dove under tables, she dropped her tray with a calculated clatter to draw the second shooter's eye. In the half-second of his distraction, she launched a heavy glass decanter with the arm of a trained operative. It shattered against the man's temple, a spray of red wine and crimson blood blooming simultaneously. She closed the gap in 3 blurring strides, her cocktail apron fluttering like a battle standard. The two predators moved in a terrifying, unspoken harmony. When Roy lunged to hamstring the first attacker, Rita was already there to catch the man's falling weapon hand, twisting the wrist until the radius snapped like dry kindling. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. It was a dance of synchronized violence. When he went low, she went high. When she parried a strike, he delivered the killing blow. Rita used a linen napkin to garrote the second operative, her eyes cold and clinical, while Roy delivered a brutal headbutt to the first, shattering the man's tactical mask and the face beneath it. In less than 60 seconds, the Cathedral of Ego was a slaughterhouse. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the hiss of a punctured radiator and the distant wail of sirens. Roy stood amidst the wreckage, his silk tie loosened, a smear of blood across his high cheekbones, looking every bit the tiger he claimed to have buried. He looked at Rita, who stood over a broken body, her breathing shallow but controlled, her server's mask completely gone. The air between them crackled with a primal, electric jolt of recognition. It wasn't just survival. It was the realization that in a city of sheep, they had finally found another wolf. Roy's gaze was dark and possessive, tracing the lethal grace in her stance. He realized in that heartbeat that he hadn't saved her, and she hadn't merely saved him. They had functioned as a single, deadly organism. The bond was forged in iron and blood, immediate and irreversible. "You're late with the check," Roy rasped, his voice thick with adrenaline and a new, dangerous curiosity. Rita didn't smile, but her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that promised she was the most beautiful disaster he would ever encounter. The sirens had barely begun to fade into the smog of the city when Roy Kings found himself in a place the Forbes photographers would never see. The safe house was a brutalist slab of concrete tucked beneath a decommissioned textile mill, smelling of cold iron and ozone. He sat on a metal folding chair, the sleeves of his blood-stained white shirt rolled up, watching Rita through the feed of a flickering security monitor. He had tracked her not through digital footprints, she had none, but through the sheer gravitational pull of her competence. She hadn't run far. She was waiting in the shadows of the lower levels, a phantom who knew that movement was a confession. When she finally stepped into the light of the debriefing room, she didn't look like a waitress anymore. The cocktail apron was gone, replaced by a dark, hooded jacket, but the stillness remained. A silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Roy didn't lead with a thank you. Men like him viewed gratitude as a debt they couldn't afford. Instead, he tossed a decrypted tablet onto the table between them. The screen glowed with the frantic, panicked communications of his own high-ranking lieutenants. "My head of security is currently explaining to a ghost from my past how the assassins missed," Roy said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "My captains are already dividing the map of my holdings. The rot isn't just at the edges, Rita. The foundation is gone." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching the hollows of her face for a trace of the woman who had served him Cabernet only hours before. He saw only the soldier. He realized then the terrifying reality of his situation. His billions were useless, his army was a nest of vipers, and his only clean asset was a woman whose real name he didn't even know. Rita didn't flinch. She leaned against the concrete wall, her eyes mapping the room's exits by habit. "You're a king without a kingdom," she stated, her voice devoid of pity. And I'm a ghost who just broke cover. That makes us both liabilities. Roy stood, moving toward her with the predatory focus that had made him the tiger of Bususan. He didn't stop until he was within her strike zone, testing the limits of her restraint. The men who attacked us weren't just hitmen. They were the vanguard. If they find you, they kill the only witness who can identify the leak. If they find me, they finish the job. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gesture to the monitors displaying the crumbling remains of his empire. I don't trust anyone who draws a paycheck from me anymore. But you fought for free. That makes you the only truth I have left. In the cold, sterile light of the bunker, the alliance was sealed. Not with a handshake, but with the mutual recognition of two monsters who had nowhere else to turn. The sanctuary of the bunker was a claustrophobic mix of cold steel and the hum of server racks, a space designed for survival, not intimacy. In the narrow hallway between the armory and the sleeping quarters, the air felt thin, charged with the residual adrenaline of their escape. Roy watched Rita as she stripped down to a charcoal tank top to tend to a graze on her shoulder. The sterile light caught the roadmap of her history, faded scars that spoke of jungle extractions and high-altitude drops. She wasn't just a ghost. She was a masterpiece of endurance. He stepped toward her, the heavy tread of his expensive boots silenced by the rubberized floor. He didn't offer to help. He simply took the antiseptic swab from her hand. Rita froze, her body instinctively calculating the lethality of his proximity, but she didn't pull away. As Roy pressed the swab to her skin, his fingers brushed the heat of her shoulder. The professional distance they had maintained through gunfire began to dissolve, replaced by a tension that was far more volatile. You move like you're expecting the world to end at any second, Roy murmured, his voice dropping to a low, resonant vibration that seemed to echo in the small space. He was so close now that he could smell the ozone on her skin and the faint, citrus scent of her shampoo, a jarringly human detail in their world of lead. Rita looked up, her gaze colliding with his. For the first time, the soldier's instinct in her eyes flickered, giving way to something raw and hungry. In my world, it usually does, she countered, her voice a breathy defiance. She reached up, her hand hovering over the silk of his collar before her fingers settled against the pulse point at his neck. His heart was hammering, not with fear, but with the same primal recognition that had ignited in the restaurant. Roy's hand moved from her shoulder to the small of her back, pulling her into the narrow space between him and the wall. The tactical debrief was forgotten. The mission was a distant noise. In this hollowed-out piece of the city, they were no longer a king and a ghost. They were two broken instruments finding a strange, violent harmony. The heat radiating between them was electric, a desperate bridge across the isolation they had both inhabited for years. When he leaned in, his lips inches from hers, the air didn't just feel charged. It felt like it was catching fire. The mask hadn't just slipped. It had shattered, revealing that beneath the armor of the Mafia boss and the operative, there was a shared, desperate need to feel something other than the cold weight of a trigger. In the silence of the safe house, the line between ally and lover vanished, replaced by a kiss that tasted of copper, scotch, and the beautiful terror of finally being seen. The fragile piece of the safe house shattered with the shrill, electronic scream of a proximity alarm. On the monitors, the perimeter gates didn't just open. They were bypassed with high-level encryption codes that only 3 people in the world possessed. Roy's face went pale, the realization of betrayal cutting deeper than any blade. It was Minjun, the man who had carried Roy's secrets for a decade, the brother who had helped build the throne, leading a tactical team through the primary breach point. The Judas kiss wasn't a gesture. It was a digital handshake that had sold their coordinates to the syndicate. We have 3 minutes before they flood the sublevels, Rita snapped, her voice snapping Roy out of his shock. She didn't waste time on sentiment. She was already grabbing a sleek, short-barreled rifle from the rack, her movements a blur of practiced lethality. They plunged into the bowels of the building, trading the sterile bunker for the decaying labyrinth of Los Angeles's forgotten infrastructure. The air grew damp and heavy with the smell of wet concrete and rusted iron. Behind them, the heavy thud of flashbangs echoed through the vents, followed by the rhythmic stomp of combat boots. Minjun knew Roy's habits, but he didn't know Rita. She led the way through a narrow drainage pipe, her flashlight cutting a surgical path through the dark. When the first interception team cut them off in a vaulted utility chamber, the escape turned visceral. Gunfire sparked against the low ceilings, the muzzle flashes illuminating the chaos in strobe light bursts. Roy fought with a desperate, scorched earth rage, his tailored shirt now a rag of sweat and grime. He took a shoulder to a syndicate mercenary, driving the man into a steam pipe, while Rita functioned as a whirlwind of lead and shadow. She moved with a terrifying economy of motion, her suppressed shots finding the gaps in the attacker's armor with a sound like dry branches snapping. They reached a service lift, a rusted cage that groaned as Rita hot-wired the controls. As the lift began its agonizingly slow ascent toward the street-level sewers, Minjun appeared at the end of the corridor. For a heartbeat, the two men locked eyes across the distance. One a king who had lost everything, the other a traitor who had gained the world. Minjun raised his weapon, but Rita was faster. Her shot didn't kill him. It took the corner of the lift's housing, showering the traitor in sparks and forcing him back as the cage rose into the dark. Emerging into the rain-slicked filth of an alleyway miles from the safe house, they were breathless and bleeding. The betrayal had stripped Roy of his remaining arrogance, leaving only the raw, jagged core of the man he used to be. He looked at Rita, her face smeared with soot, the only person left in a world that had burned to ash in a single night. They weren't just running anymore. They were a wounded animal and its shadow, ready to tear the city apart to find the man who had sold them out. The transition happened in the cold, gray hours of dawn inside a skeletal parking garage in the industrial district. Roy Kings was pacing, his movements jagged with the frustrated energy of a man who usually solved problems with a phone call or a checkbook. He was still the king in his mind, a monarch in a ruined suit, but Rita watched him with the detached gaze of a master looking at a flawed piece of steel. She realized then that if he went into the next 24 hours thinking like a boss, he would die like a target. She stepped into his path, her hand catching his chest with the firmness of a deadbolt. "Stop," she said, and for the first time, the word didn't sound like a suggestion from a subordinate. It was a command from an officer. She didn't wait for his permission. She reached out and ripped the ruined silk tie from his neck, casting it into the oily puddles on the concrete. She followed it by unceremoniously stripping his tailored jacket off his shoulders. "Your ego is a beacon," Rita said, her voice cutting through the damp air like a scalpel. "In the restaurant, you fought like a brawler. You were lucky. In the sublevels, you fought like a victim. That ends now." She forced him onto a concrete pylon, her proximity no longer a romantic invitation but a tactical invasion. She began to lecture him on the geometry of survival, not the high-level strategies of boardrooms, but the brutal physics of the street. She taught him how to breathe through the adrenaline spike, how to treat a room as a series of fatal funnels, and how to see people not as loyalists or traitors, but as silhouettes and heat signatures. Kings tried to protest, his voice rising with the old authority of the Tiger of Bususan, but Rita silenced him by placing the muzzle of an unloaded Glock against his sternum. "A title doesn't stop a bullet, Roy, and your name won't keep you warm in a shallow grave." She spent the next 3 hours stripping away his reliance on the infrastructure of his old life. She made him practice the tactical grace, the art of moving without sound, of striking without hesitation, and of disappearing before the body hits the floor. By the time the sun began to bleed through the smog, the man standing before her had changed. The billionaire was gone, replaced by something leaner and far more dangerous. His shoulders had lost their heavy, entitled slump, replaced by the coiled readiness of a soldier. He looked at Rita not as a waitress he had rescued, but as the commander who had rebuilt him from the wreckage of his own arrogance. He was no longer a king waiting for his crown to be returned. He was a survivor who had finally learned that the only throne worth having was the one you took back with blood on your hands. Rita handed him a fresh magazine, her eyes meeting his with a grim, new respect. The lesson was over. The war was just beginning. The city's heartbeat faltered as Rita executed the kill switch, plunging the syndicate's downtown headquarters into a simulated midnight. In the sudden, artificial dark, the high-rise became a skeletal mountain of glass and silence. They moved through the lobby not as intruders, but as ghosts reclaiming a haunted house. Roy felt the tactical grace Rita had beaten into him take hold. His breathing was a rhythmic hum, his footsteps light as a predator's. While the emergency generators struggled to breathe life back into the building, they reached the server vault, the digital brain of the betrayal. Rita's hands blurred over the console, her face illuminated by the eerie, ultraviolet glow of the bypass screen. She wasn't just hacking. She was performing an autopsy on a conspiracy. Beside her, Roy stood watch, his suppressed pistol an extension of his arm, his eyes scanning the pitch-black corridor for the heat signatures of his former life. The data didn't just crawl. It screamed across the drive. Names, offshore accounts, and the final confirmation of Minjun's payout. The list of traitors was a map of Roy's own heart. "Found them?" Rita whispered, the blue light reflecting in her cold, lethal eyes. They had the names. Now all that remained was the reckoning. The private airfield was a desolate expanse of oil-stained asphalt under a weeping sky. The syndicate's escape plane sat idling, a silver beast ready to vanish with the traitors. But Roy and Rita moved through the hangar like a two-headed storm. The air became a lethal fog of lead and aviation fuel. Rita led the breach, her movements a blur of tactical perfection, until a stray round from Minjun's rifle caught her in the thigh. She went down, the ghost finally rendered flesh and blood. Seeing her fall triggered something ancient and feral in Roy. The billionaire's restraint, the commander's discipline. It all burned away, leaving only the tiger. He didn't check his firing lanes. He simply tore through the remaining mercenaries with a scorched earth savagery that made even the syndicate's killers recoil. He reached Minjun at the base of the boarding stairs. There was no boardroom negotiation, no demand for an apology. Roy dropped his empty weapon and used his bare hands, his fingers finding the throat of his former brother with the surgical, brutal efficiency Rita had taught him. He got his hands dirty, staining his soul to keep her heart beating. The tiger had returned, not for a crown, but for her. The smoke from the hangar's wreckage rose into the bruised Los Angeles sky, a pyre for the life Roy Kings had spent decades building. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Roy didn't reach for his phone or his lawyers. He reached for the emergency flares and the canister of industrial accelerant Rita had staged weeks ago. To the world, and to the remaining fragments of the syndicate, the charred remains found amidst the twisted aluminum of the private jet would be evidence enough. A billionaire and his mysterious protector, consumed by the very violence they had tried to outrun. It was a digital and physical suicide, a masterclass in the final disappearing act that only a ghost could choreograph. By the time the first responders arrived to secure the perimeter, the man once known as the King of Kings was already miles away, sitting in the passenger seat of a nondescript, 10-year-old sedan that smelled of dust and faded air freshener. He had traded his blood-caked silk for a heavy flannel shirt and a ball cap pulled low over his eyes. Beside him, Rita drove with one hand, her wounded leg bandaged and braced, her gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon where the city's neon glow finally surrendered to the vast, indifferent desert. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, tactical quiet of two soldiers in a foxhole. It was lighter now, though still tempered by the knowledge of what they had left behind. Roy looked at his hands, the knuckles bruised, the skin stained with the grease of the airfield and the grit of his own survival. He was no longer a monarch, no longer a visionary, and no longer a target. He was a man with no name and a bank account that didn't exist, sitting next to a woman who had taught him that the only real power was the ability to choose who you belong to. "Where are we going?" he asked, the words feeling strange and new in a mouth that used to issue only commands. Rita didn't look away from the road, but her lips softened into the first genuine smile he had ever seen. Not the performative mask of a waitress, but the dangerous, beautiful expression of a woman who was finally free. "Nowhere anyone will look for us," she replied. They drove into the bleeding orange of the sunset, two nobodies, disappearing into the vast American expanse. Behind them, the myths of the tiger and the operative would pass into legend, whispered in dive bars and boardrooms alike. But ahead of them lay the only thing more terrifying and exhilarating than a war. A life where they didn't have to be monsters anymore. As the lights of Los Angeles flickered out in the rearview mirror, they weren't running from their past. They were finally driving toward a future they had earned with every drop of blood they'd spilled. They were ghosts now, but for the first time in their lives, they were finally alive.